We started to talk about impurity, which is the theme of this week's parasha, the concept of the paraduma, the red heifer, and the idea that there are laws of purity and impurity, and that those laws actually are not rational laws. There are many facets of those laws that really make no sense to us. And yet the Torah goes so far as to say, Zois chukas haTorah, that this notion of purity and impurity somehow tells the story of the whole of Judaism, which is strange because many people will tell you what's great about Judaism is the fact that we learn and that things make sense and that we explore and that we question. So how would something which is actually irrational come to represent the whole of Judaism? So one of the interesting things about the laws of purity and impurity, it's very interesting, people don't necessarily think about this, is how extreme and absolute those laws are. So I'll just give you an example, okay? Let's say that a person, for example, would take their finger and touch something which is impure just with the edge of their finger. So would we now say that this person's finger is impure? No, we wouldn't say that. We'd say the person is impure. It's fascinating. So that tells you that the nature of impurity is that it is not relative to how much exposure you have. Even the smallest exposure is already considered impure. Very interesting. And the reverse is also true. Let's say that a person had to go to the mikveh in order to purify themselves after having been contaminated. So the person goes into the mikveh, and as they immerse under the water, they don't go deep enough, so they have their hair sticking out above the surface of the water. So what's the halacha? That person is now not pure. Even though you'll say, but 99.9% of the person entered into the water. Like, what's the big deal? That's what you see about purity and impurity. It works in absolutes. So either you're yes or you're no. Either you're pure or you're impure. There's no grading of a person being partially impure or partially pure. So I suppose we could borrow an old cliche and say, you can't be half impure. Right? Either you're impure or you're not impure. Then it goes even one step further than that. What happens if a person becomes impure by accident? They didn't even know. So let's say that a person was walking down the street and they were completely unaware of the fact that lying just beneath the road's surface is a dead body. Somebody was buried in a shallow grave. Let's say it was a murder victim. So the person who walks over that area is totally by not only unintentional, totally unaware of the fact that there's even a problem. So would we say, okay, in that case, you're not so impure, you didn't intend. Like a guy who deliberately went and exposed himself to impurity, he is impure, but somebody, no, obviously wouldn't say that. It's regardless, it makes no difference what your intention was. It makes no difference how much you engaged with what is impure. It works in absolutes. Either a person is pure or a person is impure. So now we say Zois chukas haTorah, that these rules that apply to impurity also extend to help us understand the whole of Judaism. And that's where things become very interesting. Because when it comes to Judaism, very often you'll have people say things along the lines of, I'm more from than you. Or often people say, you're more from than me. And basically what they're saying is that there's some kind of a rating system of how Jewish people are. Now, you can definitely rate people on how observant they are. You could say this person keeps a higher standard of kashrut than me, that you could say. Or you could say that this person does 10 mitzvahs and I do 8 mitzvahs. That kind of thing you could do. But what you cannot do is rate the person based on how many things they do. Okay? And there's a very important reason for this. So that's why when people start to say things like more from or less from, there's quite a serious danger in that, because it might create a sense of hierarchy which says I'm more Jewish and you're not as Jewish, or I'm more connected to Hashem and you're not as connected to Hashem. And when you start with that kind of an attitude, well, then you create division in the community, and that division starts to become the spiritual haves and have-nots. It becomes the distinction between people who think that they are in one way or another more Jewish than the next person, and therefore they can treat other people in a particular way. And that's absolutely wrong. One of the things that we can learn from the story of purity and impurity, as the sages tell us, is you cannot ever weigh up the value of one mitzvah against another. So let's say, for argument's sake, that there's a person who, just to use an example that we can relate to, person's walking down the street minding their own business. And they don't realize that just around the corner, there's a Chabad ambush waiting for them. So as they come around the corner, there are these guys with the black hats. Excuse me, are you Jewish? And then they say, would you like to put on tefillin? So the person says, okay, fine, I'll put on tefillin. The person has absolutely no idea what tefillin are, never seen them before in his life, grew up in a totally assimilated background, didn't have a bar mitzvah, just knows that he's Jewish. And now he puts on the tefillin. So, how much of the mitzvah of tefillin has this person performed? 10%? Because he doesn't really know what it means? 20% because this is a moment of dedication to God? No, nobody would question it. His mitzvah is 100%. Just like if somebody had to touch an impure item just with the edge of their finger, the whole person would become impure. By the same token, when somebody does a mitzvah, regardless of how much of themselves is invested in the mitzvah, regardless of whether they are physically present, mentally present, emotionally present, whether they are aware of the meaning of the mitzvah, it's irrelevant. It makes no difference. Again, if a person inadvertently becomes impure, they are 100% impure. That tells me not only were they not physically touching this item with their whole body, they were not spiritually touching this item with their whole character and being and mind and soul because they were unaware of it, and yet it totally affects them. So Zois Chukas HaTorah, that teaches me that this is a principle that applies right across the whole Torah. That even when a person does a mitzvah without real appreciation of why they're doing the mitzvah, maybe they're doing it in a bit of a hackneyed fashion and they're not necessarily doing it properly. And when they meet somebody who's more frum than they are, that person might be critical of them and say, listen, you're not doing this, and whatever the case is, doesn't matter. That person at that time completely connects 100%. There's a beautiful story that they tell about the Baal Shem Tov, that once on his travels, he landed up in a particular place. The Baal Shem Tov often would travel with some of his students. And they landed up in a particular place and they stayed over at a very simple Jew's house. And this Jew, who was very sincere but very uneducated, he had a siddur in his house. That was his one Jewish book that he had. He had a siddur. And every single day he was told that you have to pray. So every single day he would take his siddur, he would open it up at the beginning, and he would read the whole thing from cover to cover. He had no clue. He didn't know that there's a difference between that some things you say during the week and other things are reserved for Shabbos, and then there's Rosh Chodesh, and then there's the festivals, and then there's Rosh Hashanah. To him, here was the Jewish prayer book. So he took the prayer book and he read it from start to finish every single day. And when the Baal Shem Tov students noticed that this is what he was doing, they said to him, listen, you're obviously not aware of the fact that there are different prayers for different days, so you don't have to say the whole thing every day. So he said to him, wow, that's amazing. Could you help me? Could you guide me? They said, sure. And they wrote on slips of paper, they wrote, this is for Shabbos, this is for Rosh Chodesh, this is for Yom Tov. And they stuck the slips of paper into the appropriate places in his siddur. And they said, no, you don't have to read the whole book from cover to cover. It's all fine. And now, as we well know, the Baal Shem Tov was a big miracle maker. And when the Baal Shem Tov and his entourage left, there was a particular river that they had to cross, and there was no ferry. So the Baal Shem Tov took a handkerchief and he threw it down on the water and kind of glided across the water using his handkerchief, some miraculous fashion. Anyhow, they get to the other side of the river and they hear shouting from behind them. They turn around and here's this Jew who they had just been at, and he's running towards them, waving his siddur in his hand. And he gets to the river, and he also needs to get across the river. So he takes his handkerchief, because he had just seen the Baal Shem Tov do it. So he takes his handkerchief and he throws it, and he also glides across the river. So he gets across the river, he comes to the Baal Shem Tov and his students, and he says, listen, you've got to help me over here, because not long after you left, I dropped the siddur and all the papers fell out, and now I don't know what you're supposed to say on which day. So the Baal Shem Tov, having observed what this fellow had just done, he said, listen here, the way that you've been davening until now is clearly 100% fine. So what that story illustrates is, sometimes you have people who do things and it doesn't necessarily look like it's so kosher, and you might want to be critical of them, and you might want to set them back on the right path so that they climb the leaderboard of Judaism and become more frum. That's the lesson that we're supposed to take from purity and impurity, that if you just touch something that is pure, you are already sucked into that purity. And there's a principle behind it that makes a lot of sense. The principle goes like this. It's taught by the Baal Shem Tov. Ha'etzem keshe'ata toifes b'miktsosoi ata toifes b'kuloi. Which means that the nature of the essence of anything is that if you touch part of the essence, you obviously touch the whole essence. Because the essence of something can't be split up and divided into little components. The essence is the essence. When we do a mitzvah, or when we daven, or when we study Torah, or whatever it is that we do, regardless of how well or how badly we do it, that's not the fact, that's not the factor to consider. What we have to consider is, are we touching Hashem's essence? And the answer to that is yes. When Hashem presents us with a mitzvah, or He gives us the opportunity to pray to Him, or He puts His wisdom into book form and allows us to study the Torah, what Hashem does is He gives us His essence. And He says, touch it. Touch that essence to the best of your ability. You don't have to compare yourself to somebody else. You don't even have to get 10 out of 10. You don't have to be hard on yourself and say, I'm not doing it exactly properly and my pronunciation is not so correct and maybe I'm doing this wrong. The main thing is touch the essence. Zois chukas haTorah. This is the principle that the whole of the Torah works on. That even the slightest, most superficial encounter that we have with those access points that Hashem has given us, davening, learning, and mitzvahs, that gives us absolute access. And so that's why you should never underestimate the value of even the most superficial mitzvah, or the smallest amount of time of learning, or even the most distracted davening. Just do it because it connects us directly to Hashem's essence.